Good evening, tributes, and welcome back to Tales of the Hunger Games. I hope you've all had a great week wherever you are. Before beginning this video, some of the more eagle-eyed ones of you might have noticed that it's entitled Part 1. This is because this week's installment is rather long, stop it, and because of that, I thought it would be a good idea to break it into two parts, the second of which will be coming on Wednesday. Next Monday will then be my week off because got things to do, Christmas shopping, etc. Well, what we can. And then the next Monday, which will be Monday the 21st, will be the 86th Games. I'd also like to thank my good friend Andrew McLean for producing all the art that is included in this series, and especially for this video. If you're a fan of this series, feel free to check out some of the other links that are in this description below that are related to this series as well. Now, without further ado, let's go. The 85th Games took place in the year 97. In accordance with the Treaty of the Reclamation, every 5 years a special set of rules would be incorporated into the Hunger Games in a special set of the games known as a Quinquennial Quell. These games were used to remind the districts of the capital's continuous command over them. On July the 3rd, President Gall made a live announcement on Capital TV in which he announced the conditions for the second Quinquennial Quell, which would take place over the coming week. Gall stated that in order to remind the districts that their citizens had turned on each other in the dark times before the Reclamation, the tribute that was reaped would select their district partner of the opposite gender. This decision immediately caused a joyful murmur amongst capital citizens, many of whom started to discuss how the reapings would be different this year. Gall proceeded to explain that for these reapings, instead of each district having a bowl full of female names and another bowl full of male names, one large bowl would contain all the names of both genders. A name would then be picked from this bowl, and if it belonged to a female citizen, she would select her male district partner, whereas if a male citizen were picked, he would select his female district partner. Subsequently, it was mentioned that volunteering would not be recognised this year, except in Districts 1 and 2. Regarding District 1, its citizens would vote for one tribute, either male or female, to represent their district, and this tribute would then select their district partner of the opposite gender. Whether they took notice of the next most popular tribute in the voting results would be their decision. As for District 2, all volunteers would fight against each other, regardless of gender, until only one remained, and this tribute would then select their district partner of the opposite gender. After a long first day of rather unusual reapings, Estelle Van Roosh arrived in District 7 as the evening sun was beginning to set through the sky. She had a brief meal with the district's mayor, his family, and Asher Seatle before they exited the town hall to witness the mass of youths in the traditional lumber brown. Estelle gave a brief speech about the importance of the quell and the bravery that tributes would show, before marching over to the extremely large reaping bowl and picking out a name from deep within. She then announced that 13-year-old Cherry Tarrant had been chosen, and a gasp was immediately heard from the outer side of the girls' reaping enclosure. This young lady was the fifth of 11 children, and came from a rather impoverished area of the district known as the Sticks. Between Cherry and her 4 siblings that were also eligible in this year's reaping, their names had been entered 189 times. A human crater formed around Cherry, whose curly black hair had wilted from the heat, and was now morphing into her grubby brown dress. Estelle had to order Cherry to hurry up, and a peacekeeper was about to make his way into the enclosure, but she finally made her way across to the aisle and was escorted by the peacekeepers to the platform, before bursting into tears. Estelle told Cherry to stop crying, before reminding her that she now had an unprecedented choice to make. Cherry's whimpering quietened as she looked out over the sea of male citizens, who were now either awkwardly fidgeting, looking down to the ground, or quietly shuffling away from the aisle side of the enclosure. After a few tense moments, Cherry descended from the platform and was escorted by the peacekeepers as she made her way down the aisle. One could hear a pin drop as she walked past the boys of her own age, and it was noted that the mayor's son, Corio, breathed out a sigh of relief when she passed his line at the enclosure, seeing as he had allegedly teased Cherry about being poor just a few days prior to this reaping. She continued onwards and eventually stopped at the back of the enclosure, where the oldest and tallest young men stood. Cherry made her way into the enclosure, even though this was strictly forbidden during a normal reaping, but was allowed this time. Each of the males along this back line were desperately trying to stand completely still, or do anything that would not attract attention, but after a minute of silently looking up and down this line, a tear dropped from Cherry's eye, and she grabbed the hand of a rather muscular young man named Junipero Bauer, who was stood on the far side of the enclosure. Junipero had already finished school, and was now a rather proficient lumberjack within the crest, which meant that he was extremely skilled with an axe, and so in this respect Cherry had made a rather wise decision. Junipero did not let out much expression as she led him to the aisle, and without making eye contact or speaking a word, the pair walked hand in hand to the platform. Within a minute, Estelle had led them into the town hall, and asked how they were feeling, but she was subsequently whisked away for the train bound for District 6, where the reapings would continue the next day. Cherry was taken to a room on the upper levels of the town hall, but she was only allowed to have 3 visitors, which caused anger from her siblings when not all of them were allowed to see her. Yet when one of Cherry's brothers selfishly tried to push past a peacekeeper, he was knocked to the ground, and her visiting time was prematurely ended. Her family were then escorted from the building, and she was placed onto the train. Whilst this commotion was taking place, Junipero was visited by his father and younger sister, Blossom, who tearfully wished him all the fortune they could muster. Junipero's girlfriend, Dora, visited him afterwards, and she spoke very few words to him, before running her hands through his blonde hair as she kissed him. The peacekeepers did not at first take any action, but when she started trying to convince Junipero even further to come back, she was quickly pulled away from him by the peacekeepers and escorted from the town hall. Cherry and Junipero were subsequently placed on the train, and Cherry began to cry almost immediately. Junipero sat there quietly and did not initially make any effort to comfort Cherry, but when she eventually managed to muster some words and said to Junipero that she was sorry for choosing him, he sighed before telling her that he forgave her. He then asked Cherry why she had chosen him, and she revealed that it was because he had a kind face, which made him stand up and look in the mirror for a minute or so, whilst Cherry continued to cry. The pair spoke to each other about their differing lives in District 7, before their mentor, Asher Seatle, entered the carriage and sat down with them. Whilst Cherry helped herself to food, Junipero tried asking Asher for some advice about what to do in the arena, but she casually laid back on another sofa and told him that they were likely to die, whether she helped them or not. When Cherry heard this, she stopped herself from biting the piece of meat that she had been about to eat and looked at Asher in an alarmed manner. Asher then went on to list all the different ways that each of her mentees had died so far, and that no matter how much she helped them, they would both probably die within the week. She snapped her fingers at the present Avox, who brought her a pint of red wine, and as she sipped from the glass, Cherry sat down on the sofa and whimpered, which prompted Junipero to put his arm around her and try to comfort her, although Asher remained indifferent to Cherry's upset, and she stated that she was just being honest with them. Shortly after this, Cherry retired to her carriage, but Junipero insisted that Asher give him some advice. She then simply turned on a compilation of every kill that had happened in the game since the reclamation, and told Junipero to make notes on how each tribute could have avoided their death. Although he at first seemed rather annoyed with Asher's lack of input, he soon became engaged in this exercise, and the pair started to discuss the deaths in further detail, especially during Asher's games where she had caused several of these deaths. The next morning they arrived in the capital, and were greeted by crowds of fans. Several ladies posed rather suggestively with Junipero, whose good looks already seemed to be winning over many citizens in the capital, whilst Cherry looked more like a lost child, according to some. After a few minutes, Asher said that they needed to move on, and after pulling Junipero away from a rather feisty gaggle of young capital ladies, the trio left the station and headed to the tribute's accommodation quarters. Cherry in particular was shocked by the lavish decorations within the apartment, and she was in fact speechless for a few minutes, until Junipero turned on the main screen to Capital TV, where the reaping for District 6 was about to begin. The pair watched as Estelle did her opening speech, and she seemed rather taken aback by the forlorn and hopeless appearances of many of this district's youths, the vast majority of whom were clad in dirty black shirts, dresses and cloaks. Yet Estelle probably had no way of knowing that since the reclamation, most citizens of this district, young and old, were likely to ingest a strong dose of morphling before the reaping took place, and so many of them were likely oblivious to what was going on. The usual speech occurred, and despite 2 or 3 of the district citizens passing out, Estelle made it through without stopping. She then reached into the reaping bowl and picked a name, this time from the very top, which she revealed to be 16-year-old Arizona Mendez. Within seconds, a string of words was heard from Arizona's position, which later had to be censored, and this caused a few murmurs of amusement from the crowd, which even prompted the nearby peacekeepers to ready their guns. Short for his age, yet wise for his years, Arizona already worked in the hangars that housed the new forms of hovercraft, where he was often made by his superiors to enter the smaller nooks and crannies of this craft for engineering and cleaning checks. As Arizona walked down the aisle, he pushed his fluffy auburn hair away from his face, so that he could eye the girls to his right, who were mainly looking straight ahead and doing anything they could to avoid eye contact with him. Estelle shook Arizona's hand, and then told him that he faced an unprecedented decision, and that he should choose wisely, as his life may depend on the choice that he was about to make. As Arizona walked down alongside the female enclosure, his skin turned an even paler shade of white, and the girls of the district tried to look away, with some crying, perhaps in an effort to warrant sympathy and not be chosen. Yet when Arizona reached the further end of the aisle, he appeared to be looking very carefully along the lines of girls, as if he were looking for someone in particular. Eventually, after a few moments of close inspection, he gasped with a strange kind of joy when he saw a girl with fuzzy black hair who was clearly trying to hide behind the girl who stood next to her. Without any further delay, Arizona edged through the enclosure towards 17-year-old Madison Hawker, before placing his hand on her shoulder and shouting that she would be his district partner. Well known around the morphling dens of District 6, Madison often boasted that she was able to access anything you couldn't get in the market, although it was often rumoured that she had indeed never engaged in morphling itself, but preferred a stiff drink instead. Madison proceeded to look at Arizona like she was about to cause him serious harm, although as Arizona took her hand and led her to the platform, the presence of peacekeepers was enough to deter her from trying anything like this. Estelle then shook hands with Madison, before prompting her and Arizona to do the same, even though it was clear that neither of them wanted to. As Madison very reluctantly shook Arizona's hand, she was heard to mutter something to him, and although the cameras were not able to pick up what she had said, Estelle's face was one of bewilderment, yet amusement. She dismissed the crowds and entered the town hall with Arizona and Madison. Whilst the pair waited for their families to visit, it is reported that one could hear the usual reaping day shenanigans coming from the nearby morphling dens, which made Madison cry, although it is unknown why this emotion was brought out of her. With no living family members, Arizona was visited by two of his fellow hanger monkeys, Raleigh and Wisconsin, who told him that he had made the right choice. It was then that Arizona revealed he had chosen Madison because she had sold him a dodgy batch the previous week, which had led him to having a bad trip and getting into trouble with peacekeepers for being late for work. Raleigh then stated that he had a feeling this was why he was late for work that day, and the three laughed, before Arizona was escorted down to the train. As for Madison, she was not visited by anyone, probably because most of the lowlifes that she associated with were already celebrating the fact that they were safe, without any concern for Madison's well-being. She cried as she sat alone in the room, before being taken down to the train station. Within minutes of the train leaving, the pair were arguing, but this soon turned into a physical fight. Their mentor secretly watched through the door, but when she saw Madison grabbing onto Arizona's hair, she stormed into the room and snapped her fingers at the present Avox to help tear them apart. He did as she ordered, and the pair were quickly pulled to other sides of the carriage. Madison then looked round to see who had just pulled her away from Arizona, and she was surprised to see that this was Irene Al-Fayed. Madison most likely recognized her as the former capital representative to District 6, and she abruptly asked Irene why she was on the train with them, to which Irene replied that it was a pleasure to meet Madison as well. She then ordered Madison and Arizona to sit down sensibly, and explained that she had volunteered to be the mentor from now on, to which Madison shouted that as Irene was from the capital, she would not know anything about winning the games. Irene let out a breath of amusement, which seemed to confuse her mentees, before telling Madison that she already reminded her of someone that she once knew. This confused the pair even further, but Irene told them that they both needed to listen carefully, before reminding them that what is done, and that whether they liked it or not, they were going to be fighting in the games together, and their best chance of survival was to work together. Eventually, both Arizona and Madison calmed down to some degree, and Irene explained what would happen before the games. Shortly after she had finished this explanation, Arizona asked if he could have some of the wine that was visible within the drinks cabinet, and Madison chimed in that she would also like some. Irene seemed quite shocked and said that they were both too young, which made Madison laugh out loud. However, Irene eventually agreed that if they could both correctly answer some questions that related to the information which she had given about the upcoming week, then they could each have one glass of wine. Irene proceeded to question her mentees, but Madison seemed to have forgotten a lot of the key information about the assessment of training scores. Although Arizona had gotten almost every one of Irene's questions correct, she stated that they could only have a glass if they both answered enough questions correctly. Arizona called Madison a word that made Irene give him a rather angry look, but she locked the alcohol cabinet and said that she would come back in half an hour to question them once more. Another argument raged on between Arizona and Madison for roughly 15 minutes, but they eventually settled down and reviewed what they knew about the upcoming week. Irene came back, and the pair proved that they knew almost everything about the events of the next week, and therefore Irene allowed them each one glass of wine. As they drank, Irene showed them the highlights of her games on the television screen, which Madison at first claimed to be fake, until Irene showed her the tracker scar on her arm. Arizona gasped when Irene stabbed Raskus on the cornucopia at the end of the games, but Irene stated how she had not wanted to do this, especially to someone that she had considered to be her friend, but that she had no other option. She then put her arms around both Arizona and Madison, before telling them that the games were all about sacrifice, and that they would need to sacrifice anything that allowed them to hold prejudice or hatred against each other. The pair seemed to understand, and Irene dismissed them to their carriages. The next morning they arrived in the capital, and many citizens, who were wearing the traditional black leather gowns of District 6, immediately greeted them. However, both Arizona and Madison seemed somewhat overwhelmed by this attention, and Irene quickly made excuses before managing to remove them from the platform without any disdain from the crowd. She took them to the tribute's accommodation quarters, where they were fitted for their parade outfits. The following night, the parade took place, and it was reported by a range of the stylists, security staff, and mentors that many arguments were going on between the pairs of tributes like nothing they had ever seen before, which even resulted in Barley from 9 slapping Fructo from 9 hard enough for him to fall back from the carriage that he had just mounted, after Fructo accused Barley of picking him simply because he had rejected her advances the previous month. The parade soon got underway, and the tributes who made the greatest impression this year were Paulus and Discordia, both from 2, who wore sparkling golden tunics and held their hands up together in a show of unity. Caesar Flickerman had once again been invited back for this quell in order to commentate with Eugenia. Caesar mentioned how Paulus and Discordia had started dating shortly before their district's reaping games, which he joked was what likely caused Paulus to choose Discordia as his district partner, even though she only came 5th in the reaping games. Arizona and Madison were dressed in garments made entirely from black tire materials. Allegedly, Madison had been very reluctant to wear this material due to it having what she described as flammable qualities, but once Irene convinced her that it was safe, she eventually wore her dress. These outfits were well tailored, but still looked somewhat surreal, although the pair was certainly not the worst dressed of the evening. It was also noticed by some eagle-eyed viewers that whilst they rode in the carriage and waved to the crowd, the pair seemed to be very subtly having an argument through their gritted teeth and smiles. On the carriage behind them were Junipero and Cherry, who were covered in bark with branches seemingly coming out of their heads. However, in a rare move for a parade, the pair's outfits contained the different colours of their namesakes, with Junipero's branches containing dark blue juniper berries, and Cherry's branches containing shiny red cherries. Junipero held Cherry's hand during this parade, and towards the end, Cherry raised their hands together, which garnered a cheer from the crowd. Once the parade had ended, Irene congratulated Madison and Arizona for not having a punch-up during the parade, and not moaning about their outfits. When they were back in their apartment, she gave them each a glass of wine, and informed them about the training the next day. As for Cherry and Junipero, the former seemed rather exhausted, and fell asleep almost immediately after returning to their apartment, whilst Junipero stayed up a bit longer, and had a deep conversation with Asher about her life since the games, before he eventually went to bed. Before the training had even begun the next day, Training Master Crane warned all the tributes that he would not tolerate any fighting between them until they were in the arena, which he most likely announced due to the conflicts that were already occurring between many district partners. Junipero spent practically the entirety of the 2 days practicing by himself with an axe, and using it to chop through wood or throw at various targets. Although he was already strong at axe wielding, his skills appeared to improve even further during this concentrated time, and Lena, from 5, who spent a lot of time practicing at the adjacent bow and arrow station, appeared rather intimidated by his displays. Cherry aimlessly wandered around the training room at first, and seemed rather scared of the fighting that was occurring all around her. At one point, Mohair, from one, threw a spear straight through the head of a dummy before turning around and devilishly winking at Cherry, which made her walk away as quickly as she could straight towards the nearest station, which was in fact the survival station. Once Cherry sat inside, she crouched down against a wall, but screamed when a camouflaged Madison suddenly appeared behind her. Madison quickly tried to calm Cherry, and the training staff quickly came over, but Cherry reassured them that there was no danger. Although Madison apologized, she struggled to make it through without laughing, which in turn made Cherry laugh, and she asked Madison to show her how she had managed to colour herself into the wall. Madison and Cherry proceeded to work together, and appeared to build a strong rapport with each other over these 2 days, during which time Cherry greatly improved her camouflaging skills, and by the end of the second day, she was able to hide herself against many different surfaces. During the second day, they joked about Proton and Tweet, both from 3, who were making loud humming noises whilst working in the electric station, and when Proton shouted after receiving a rather painful electric shock, Madison tried not to laugh when Tweet jumped from the sound that he made. Arizona, who had been practicing using the swords with Jack, from 8, came over to see why Madison was laughing, and although she seemed somewhat cold towards Arizona at first, she introduced him to Cherry, and Arizona told her that he liked her parade outfit, which made her smile. The day after training, the assessments took place. It is unknown what Arizona and Madison chose to do for their displays, but judging by the colourful mess that Junipero later complained about, it most likely involved camouflaging themselves, and this resulted in each of them only scoring a 5. Junipero followed, and it is generally agreed that he must have used an axe, which scored him an 8, whilst Cherry's talent is generally unknown, although whatever she did only scored her a 3, which gave her the lowest score of the pack, along with Barley from 9, Fern from 11, and Capsule from 12. On the other end of the scale were Aurus from 1, Discordia from 2, and Bill from 10, who each managed to score a 10. The following interviews were even more interesting than those of a normal year. The career tributes came across as charmingly as they usually do, and so when Proton was interviewed almost straight after them, he made a rather negative impression upon the Capitol's audience when he refused to speak or respond to either Caesar or Eugenia's questions. As for Oasis from 4, he seemed to entice Eugenia and Caesar's interests by discussing how he planned to use his skills with a fishing hook in order to kill other tributes. When it was time for Madison's interview, she made a relatively favourable impression, although she seemed somewhat intimidated by the bright lights and large crowd, and when Eugenia asked her about Arizona, she seemed incapable of saying anything nice about him. As for Arizona's interview, he appeared to perk Caesar's interest by talking about his work in the hangar, although Eugenia asked if this was in fact safe, which resulted in laughter from the audience. Cherry seemed rather scared, but after a bit of coaxing from Caesar, where he managed to list the things that Cherry could do well, she seemed slightly more confident, and by the end of her interview, the audience were rather endeared to her. Junipero followed Cherry, and Eugenia appeared incapable of taking her eyes off him, which she made no attempt to hide. However, she jokingly became annoyed with Junipero, as did many of the audience, when he mentioned his girlfriend back in District 7, and how she was his motivation to win the games and make it back home. On a serious note at the end of his interview, both Caesar and Eugenia wished him luck, and it appeared that he had done rather well in this interview. The most disastrous set of interviews were by far those of Milka and Bill, both from 10. Milka spent most of her time talking about how much she hated Bill, who had emerged was her ex-boyfriend. She ranted on about how it was bad enough that he had put her through 2 years of misery within their relationship, but now that he had chosen her for these games, she had no other option than to despise him. During Bill's interview, he laughed off these comments and proceeded to go into rather intricate details about how he slaughtered the cattle in his family's abattoir, which left Eugenia rather clearly trying to move on to another avenue of conversation, while Caesar, who was usually unafraid of any topic, seemed rather disgusted by what he was hearing. Once the rather bland interview of Capsule from 12 had ended, the new game maker, Artulia Fling, was welcomed to the stage. It emerged that Artulia was the protege of game maker Whimsywick, and that during the incident with the vents of the last year's games, she had managed to recalibrate the power of these vents and therefore stop the games from falling into complete chaos. Fling spoke about how she looked forward to this new role and having good fun within the arena that had been predetermined for this year's games, and that she aimed to pay homage to this iconic location. The next day, each of the tributes, both male and female, were dressed in three-piece suits of their district colours. As they got ready to enter the tubes, their mentors came to wish them off. When Irene visited Arizona, she told him how handsome he looked, and she reminded him of how brave he had been, and that even though Madison could be difficult at times, he would need to work with her as much as he could. He thanked Irene for her mentorship, and she subsequently visited Madison's holding room. Madison was still looking at the black suit that she was wearing in complete disbelief, and Irene joked that it suited her, to which Madison looked back at her with an ironic grin. Irene was then serious, and told Madison that she needed to forgive Arizona for choosing her, and that he had to choose someone. Irene then embraced her, and told her that she had the power to win the games if she tried. Madison tearfully nodded, and Irene left the room, allegedly with tears in her own eyes. As for Junipero and Cherry, it is unknown if Asher visited them in their holding rooms, but it is strongly suggested that she did not, as she was spotted travelling within Scotland throughout these games. The tributes proceeded to enter the tubes, and waited for their podiums to rise into the arena. However, after almost a minute's wait, a thick gas descended into these tubes from above. Many of the tributes were immediately alarmed by the presence of this gas, and they tried to break back out of their tubes, with Bill actually managing to put a dent into the glass. Yet within 45 seconds, all the tributes had collapsed, and were now lying unconsciously against the sides of the tubes. Once it was confirmed that all 24 tributes had lost consciousness, groups of peacekeepers entered the holding rooms and collected them, before placing them onto a wagon and transporting them to the real cornucopia that lay on the other side of the complex. This year's games took place in the Jansen Mansions and Studios. Before this year's games began, it was only known by a handful of capital leaders that in Bluebell Jansen's will, she had permitted her mansion and studios to be used for a year at the games after she died, and seeing as this quell was indeed a special occasion, it was selected as the year for this arena to be used. Bluebell's family members, pets and staff were secretly evacuated in the week before these games, along with their most valuable possessions and the most expensive art that belonged to the family. It was also a condition within the will that any damage that occurred during these games would need to be repaired once the games had ended. The complex was surrounded by dense woodlands, but these were inaccessible to tributes, who could only remain within the complex itself. A mansion lay at the northern end, which comprised of two large towers with a small hallway in the middle that connected them together. A long road ran down from the northern mansion to the southern end, with servants' apartments making up most of blocks A to F in the northern half, whilst actors' accommodation was located in blocks G to L through the southern half of the complex. A large studio also sat at the end of the bend at the bottom of the southern road. Shortly before the games went live, the peacekeepers delivered each of the tributes to the dining room that lay on a middle floor of the Jansen mansion. This large room was completely white, in accordance with fashionable architecture around the time of the Second Rebellion, when the mansion was renovated. A long table lay in the middle of the room, with 12 exquisite chairs placed either side of the table, which allowed each of the 24 tributes a place to sit. The tributes were carefully placed in their assigned chairs, and electronic cuffs that were attached to the arms of these chairs were meticulously placed around the tributes' wrists, in order to ensure that they could not move before the gong sounded. In front of each tribute were placed a shiny white plate and goblet, which contained a sandwich and red wine respectively. Apart from this food and drink, no other supplies were provided within this room, although each tribute also had a sharp knife placed in front of them as well. Once Game Maker Fling had walked around the room several times and carefully inspected that every minute detail was in place, she tapped her glasses twice with her finger, and the peacekeepers proceeded to place a white bag over each tribute's head, in order to stop them from seeing. However, Fling had kindly requested that each of these bags contain a hole around the tribute's mouth, so that there was no chance of them suffocating before the games had even begun. Fling and the peacekeepers then returned to the control room that was hidden in the woodlands just outside the complex, and the signal was given to begin broadcasting the dining room on Capital TV. As the cameras came into focus and the dining room became visible, murmurs of confusion buzzed around Snow Square, with a cornucopia like this having never been seen before. It was subsequently announced by Eugenia that tributes were fighting in an arena that had been kindly donated by the late, great Bluebell Jansen, which mustered cheers throughout Panem. The camera then came back to the dining room, and within seconds, a loud and high-pitched noise was heard. Many tributes immediately awoke from this noise and desperately tried to free their hands from the cuffs, with some of them screaming in panic, which proceeded to wake the remaining tributes, and within seconds they were all awake, either screaming, shouting for help, breathing erratically, or a mixture of these three actions. Yet they were all unable to see anything except for the white linen on the inside of the bags over their heads. Caesar proceeded to wish the tributes luck, and that the odds be in their favour, before beginning the countdown from 20. When it reached 0, the gong sounded, and all 48 cuffs suddenly opened, which resulted in the vast majority of tributes immediately ripping the bags from their heads and forcing themselves up from their chairs. Upon a slow-motion replay that was shown later in the day, many tributes were initially confused about their surroundings once they were able to see, with some glancing at those either side of them, others looking for the exit, and a few looking for anything that resembled a weapon. As the opening sound of chaos erupted, Arizona from 6 immediately ripped off his headbag, and apparently without a second thought, grabbed a sandwich from in front of him, whilst Fern from 11 to his right did the same, and the pair immediately looked at each other in disbelief. Arizona then ran past Fern and away from the table, whilst Aurus from 1 smashed the head of Capsule from 12 against the table, and a stream of red wine and blood went flying into Arizona's face as he ran past the pair. Whilst Arizona seemed to be looking for an exit, he stopped running when he saw Madison from 6 on the other side of the table. Rather strangely, she had initially grabbed her goblet of wine and was drinking from it as successfully as she could, whilst trying to run past Paulus from 2, who was stabbing the girl from 8 with his knife. Arizona immediately ran around to the other side of the table, almost knocking over Lena from 5, who was grabbing as many sandwiches as she could, whilst glass and blood flew around her. He grabbed Madison by the arm, and she looked at him with almost no expression. He shouted at her about what she was doing, and it appeared that she was in some kind of shock. Yet just as the boy from 11 was thrown onto the table next to Madison, and he desperately tried to defend himself from Jack from 8, who was now armed with a knife, Arizona grabbed Madison by the hand, and the pair proceeded to run to the door at the eastern end of the room. With a sandwich and a half-drunk goblet of wine between them, the pair sprinted down the stairwell as quickly as they could. They could hear someone running down the stairs ahead of them, which was shown to be Tweet from 3, but as they made their way down these stairs, they could also hear someone running behind them as well, which was revealed to be Milka from 10, and so they continued to flee from the sound of smashing plates and frenzied screams that were still coming from the dining room. Whilst Madison laughed almost uncontrollably, she and Arizona hurtled down the stairs, and he shouted that Madison was mad for taking the wine, to which she responded in a sing-song voice that Capital Wine must be fine, which later became an advertising jingle after these games, although it appeared that Madison was still in psychological denial as to what was going on. Once the pair reached the bottom of the stairwell, they found themselves within the large oak-covered hall of the mansion, and without wishing to waste any more time, they ran straight through this hall, and after heading through the front door, they proceeded to run across the terrace. Madison initially panicked when she reached the edge of the terrace and saw the 10-foot drop to the main road below, but just as Arizona was trying to convince her to jump with him, a smash of glass was heard from the building above them, followed by a scream, as the boy from 5 fell through the air towards them, which was shown to have happened after he was thrown through the dining room's window by Bill from 10. Upon seeing this, Madison panicked, and she and Arizona jumped onto the ground below, which fortunately for them did not seem to hurt their feet. They then ran forwards, but Junipero from 7 ran from behind the corner of a building, which sent both him and Arizona crashing to the ground. As for the tributes from District 7, once the gong had sounded, Junipero immediately ripped the bag from his head, but before he could even react to what was going on, he was punched in the side of his head by Mohair from 1, who was sat to his right. Without even appearing to think twice, Junipero picked up the plate in front of him and smashed it against Mohair's face, just as she was about to punch Proton from 3, who was sat on her other side. This caused glass to break against her forehead, and she shouted out in pain. Junipero then pushed his chair back and practically threw himself away from the table. As he lay on the floor, he looked around and saw Cherry from 7, who was still sat on the end of the table, apparently too scared to even do anything. Yet miraculously, Nobody had even seemed to notice her yet. Junipero looked back to see that Mohair was now trying to stab Proton with her knife, but a few spaces to their right, Bill from 10 had just broken off the leg of a chair, and he proceeded to run it through the stomach of the girl from 4, which caused her to collapse, and Bill looked away from her, straight towards Junipero, whom he proceeded to march towards. Junipero quickly got up to run, but the girl from 12 ran in front of Bill, and this seemed to distract him, so whilst Bill picked her up and threw her across the table, Junipero got to his feet and ran towards Cherry, who was still transfixed to her chair. He spotted Discordia from 2 running straight towards her with a knife from the other side of the table, and so he grabbed Cherry's hand, and she suddenly jumped in shock before looking up at Junipero. When Discordia was within meters of Cherry and Junipero, Cherry picked up the goblet of wine and in a panicked manner threw it straight at Discordia's face. But just as Discordia shouted out in disgust, Junipero grabbed Cherry and pulled her so quickly towards the western door that her feet hardly touched the ground. They proceeded to run down the stairwell, away from the violent clamour that was occurring throughout the dining room, and they very quickly found themselves in the hallway of the Jansen mansion. Junipero seemed slightly disorientated, and he looked around for an exit, but just as they heard Discordia's loud threats as she ran down the stairs towards them, Cherry pointed towards the front door, and this time it was she who led Junipero. He ran with her, and the pair proceeded across the terrace, although they were confused by the lack of steps leading down from this terrace. After looking around in a panic, Cherry pointed at some steps that were at the back of the space between the 2 towers, and although it took a little longer to head down these widening steps, they made it safely to the main road and hid next to the nearest building on the left of the road. Yet just as their eyes darted around for the direction in which they should head, they heard the glass of the dining room window smashing, and the screams of the boy from 5 as he fell to the terrace below. Cherry seemed scared, but Junipero practically yanked her by the arm and pulled her towards the main road, but just as they started running, they failed to see Madison and Arizona. Junipero then collided with Arizona, and they both fell to the ground. As they got up, both Junipero and Arizona seemed wary of each other, and a fight looked like it was about to ensue. But Madison and Cherry shouted at both of their partners to carry on, and the boys appeared to recognize that their partners were friends, and so as the quartet ran down the road between the blocks that contained the servants' quarters, they realized that they seemed to have made a de facto alliance with each other. Arizona sprinted towards the door of the C block on his left, and he tried to open it, but it was locked. Junipero then tried the door of the F block on his right, but this was also locked. As the group ran further down the road, Madison looked around for an open window or place to hide, but she looked worried when she noticed Proton and Tweet appearing at the top of the main road. Cherry then spotted a slightly open door on the ground floor of the J block on her right, and she shouted at her 3 allies to enter this building with her. The group quickly ran through the door, and Junipero slammed it shut behind them, before running on upwards through the building with his allies. Each block contained only 4 floors, and the group reached the top floor within a minute. They ran into the apartment on the left of this floor, which had a sign saying J7 on its door. After entering and collapsing in exhaustion, Madison suddenly got back up and shouted that they needed to lock the apartment's door, but Junipero and Arizona seemed to already be thinking of this, as they were desperately trying to slam the door shut. But little did they know that all the locks on these apartments had deliberately been removed for these games. As the boys appeared to worry about what they could do to keep the apartments safe, Cherry ran over to the window of the living room and looked out at the main road to see Milka desperately trying to enter the I block opposite. Cherry then marched back out into the corridor of the apartment and said that they could keep watch from the living room. Arizona initially seemed a bit confused by what she meant, but Madison quickly pointed out that they could take turns to sit by the window in order to look out onto the street, and also sit outside the front door of this apartment to hear if anyone was coming up to the stairwell. After a few moments of silence, Junipero agreed to this, and the 4 of them seemed to relax to some degree. Arizona and Junipero introduced themselves to each other properly, and spoke a little about what life was like in their own districts, whilst Madison and Cherry rested in the living room, and looked for any food in the cupboards, although unfortunately for them, they could not find any. An hour passed, and 5 cannons were heard. They continued to keep watch, with the girls watching from the window, and the boys keeping an eye on the stairwell, but not a lot was seen on either side, although the girls spotted Bill walking down the main road with a bloodied chair leg still in his hand, and apparently on the lookout for targets. The boys announced that they were going to check the remaining apartments in this block for any useful supplies. Madison said that they would need to be careful, and Arizona somewhat sarcastically asked her if she could announce this out the window to the other tributes. As the boys descended through the building, both pairs of tributes discussed their relationships with their district partners. Cherry jokingly teased Madison that she fancied Arizona, to which she responded that he was strictly a customer. Although when Cherry appeared confused and asked Madison what she sold to him, Madison said that it did not matter, before quickly changing the subject. Meanwhile, the boys did not have a lot of luck in apartments J6 down to J3 on the third and second floors. They failed to find any food or water, although they took the blankets from various beds and placed them on the stairwell, ready to go back to apartment J7 so that they could stay warm that night. After a bit of prodding from Arizona, Junipero admitted that he was a bit annoyed with Cherry for choosing him, but that there was not a lot that he could do about it now, to which Arizona replied that he wished Madison would see it this way. However, once they were on the ground floor in apartment J2, the boys were delighted to find a loaf of bread in the bread bin, which they took back upstairs with them, along with the blankets. As the next few hours went by and the sun started to set, the group ate their bread and discussed where they could access clean water. Madison then walked over to the kitchen sink, but Cherry stated that this water could be poisonous, to which Madison said that surely this would not be the case. Yet when Cherry asked Madison to drink some, in order to prove that it was safe, Madison eventually conceded, and said that she would only try it later if they became extremely thirsty. Another hour went by, and the group continued to rest in the apartment, but just as the darkness of the evening set in, they began to hear a rather shrill screeching from outside. Junipero looked out the window and asked what the hell these animals were, but when Madison reached the window as well, she seemed confused and asked him if they did not have cats in District 7, to which he shook his head in bewilderment. The quartet watched as a large clouder of cats meowed its way down the road, with some of them breaking off and entering each block that they passed. Junipero and Cherry watched in alarm as they saw approximately 10 cats climbing into an open window of apartment J1 below. Madison asked why the boys had not closed this window earlier, to which they replied that they had not entered this apartment, and they therefore did not see that the window was open. Cherry asked in a scared manner if cats were dangerous, and Madison and Arizona looked at each other, before Arizona said that they were usually just a bit territorial. Madison and Cherry once again watched from the window in the living room as the cats roamed between the blocks, whilst Junipero and Arizona waited outside the apartment and tried to look down the stairwell, although little did they appear to realize that some of the cats had climbed up the drain pipes on the outside of the block and were now on the roof, which resulted in Cherry jumping when a cat landed on the balcony by the window. Madison immediately tried to reassure her, but as more cats jumped from the roof onto the balcony and then poured at the window, more cats were also coming up the stairwell towards the boys. As they got nearer, Arizona said to Junipero that they did not need to worry and that the cats should be harmless, but just as two rather furry ginger queen cats made their way up the final set of stairs towards the boys, Junipero appeared worried, and Arizona quietly asked if he had really never seen a cat before. Junipero then pointed straight at the cats and asked why they had come so close, but before Arizona could even reply, a cannon was heard, and this not only alerted Junipero, but also the cats. The larger of the queens proceeded to hiss and launch itself at Junipero, who screamed out in a panic. He shouted and tried to throw himself back, but as he shouted, the cat clawed at his face, which resulted in Arizona kicking this cat through the air and back down the stairs. The other cat hissed loudly and launched itself at Arizona, but he managed to cover himself with one of the blankets that he and Junipero had taken earlier, and he quickly pushed the cats away with this blanket, before hurrying himself and Junipero back into the apartment and slamming the door. Junipero shouted out in pain and held his hands to his facial scars as he stumbled through the corridor, whilst Madison was trying to reassure Cherry that they were safe, whilst the amount of cats on the balcony was steadily increasing. Yet as these cats continued to pour against the window whilst hissing and meowing, Arizona said that he had an idea. He ran over to the sink and grabbed an empty bowl, before filling it up with water. Once it was full, he asked Madison to open the balcony's window very slightly, but not wide enough to let a cat through. She seemed perplexed, but he said that they needed to act now, and so she readied herself by the window. Junipero quickly made his way back into the corridor, whilst Madison opened the window a few inches. The cats immediately began to claw at this gap in the window, but Arizona poured the water through it, and the cats very quickly let their indignation show by hissing and angrily meowing at Arizona. He grinned and shouted at Cherry to get him some more water. She did this whilst Madison kept the window in position, and Arizona proceeded to pour the next load of water onto the cats. The process was repeated until the now rather miserable and soaked cats left the balcony, without any further injuries to this group, and within an hour all the cats returned to the control room. Although many tributes had received minor scratches and other injuries from the cats, which Eugenia announced were Bluebell's favourite animals, only one tribute, Capsule from 12, had been fatally injured, after he trod on one of the cat's tails by accident and incurred the feline fury that followed, which resulted in him tripping down a set of stairs and breaking his neck before being removed from the arena by a deathclaw. For the rest of the evening, the quartet agreed to take turns keeping watch and sleeping. At midnight, Cherry and Arizona watched from the living room window as the portraits of the girl from 4, the boy from 5, the girl from 8, the boy from 11, and Capsule and the girl from 12 were all shown in the sky, which left 18 tributes remaining. As the sun rose the next morning, most tributes awoke to the sound of a cannon, which was shown to belong to Jack from 8 when he was thrown from a window at the C block by Bill. Cherry immediately jumped from the sound, and Arizona grabbed her before she could panic, and she soon calmed down. Madison and Junipero, who had been taking turns to sleep outside the apartment, entered the living room, and the group ate some bread together. Madison was now rather thirsty, and without thinking, she drank some water from the tap. Cherry quickly tried to warn her, but it was too late, and Madison had already swallowed this water. A few seconds went by with no action, but Madison suddenly started coughing, at first not too violently, but soon she could hardly keep her head still. She grabbed onto her throat and fell to her knees, which made Cherry scream in worry. However, just as Cherry ran over, Madison suddenly looked up and grinned, before laughing out loud. Cherry was instantly annoyed, and Arizona shouted that he thought she was dying, and that this was not funny, although Junipero appeared to find it slightly amusing. Yet whilst Cherry and Junipero drank from the tap, Arizona told Madison that he did not find this funny, and as he continued to berate her, Madison said that he would probably be glad if she died, since he had picked her to be here. Arizona became very angry at this accusation, and reminded Madison that he had helped her to leave the dining room at the start of the games, to which Madison replied that this was only because Irene had told them to help each other. The argument continued through the morning until noon, despite Junipero and Cherry trying to calm them both down. But just when they seemed worried that the pair might actually turn on each other, an announcement was made, and the argument quickly stopped. Game Maker Fling congratulated the tributes on surviving the first night, and she hoped that they were settled in to the arena, but she proceeded to tell them that she hoped that they were not too comfortable, as they would each have 1 hour to move to another building, or their trackers would detonate if they had not left their current building. This immediately caused mayhem throughout the arena, with various groups arguing about when they should leave their current buildings, and where they should try to head to, or if they should even try to return later to their current buildings. However, with no further instructions, Madison, Arizona, Junipero, and Cherry eventually decided to head to the I block that was over the road from their current location. As they looked out the window and saw Milka successfully running across to the G block without incident, they decided that now was the right time to act. They slowly made their way down the stairs, albeit without any weapons, and they waited by the main door at the bottom of the stairwell. Unfortunately for them, they could not see through this door, and although Arizona could not hear anything through the door, he stated that he was unsure if this was due to the door being extremely thick, or due to a lack of action on the other side, and therefore, with the hour of safety quickly running out, he told the others that they needed to cross the road as soon as possible. Cherry appeared to be about to panic, but he winked at her and thrust the door open. Arizona immediately looked out and could not see anyone, so he grabbed Cherry by the hand and they ran to cross the road. Junipero and Madison quickly followed suit, but just as they started to run, they heard a loud jeer and excited shouts coming from their left, and to their horror, they spotted Aurus and Paulus running down the road towards them, whilst Discordia and Mohair were aiming a pair of crossbows at them from the top of the road. Madison screamed as the male careers came nearer, and Junipero picked up Cherry, before running to the right and shouting to Arizona and Madison to head to the studio at the bottom of the road. Discordia shot an arrow that hit just inches from Madison's foot, and Arizona grabbed her by the hand. The group ran for the next 20 seconds as Aurus and Paulus neared them, and another arrow was shot, which hit Arizona in the leg. He immediately fell over, and screamed in pain, and Madison looked round to see him, whilst the approaching male careers grinned with delight. Luckily for the group, the studio's gates were already open, and as Cherry and Junipero pushed through the main door of the studio itself, there was a split second when Madison looked back at Arizona, who screamed at her for help. But as Aurus and Paulus approached to within 50 meters of them, she swore and ran back to grab Arizona. She struggled to pick him up, and Junipero ran back to help her. They then struggled to the door, just as Aurus ran through the gates towards them. With less than a second to spare, Junipero slammed the door behind them, but Aurus managed to get his hand through the door and was now trying to jab his knife around inside the doorway, whilst Junipero and Madison were desperately trying to keep the door closed against him. Cherry was now on the verge of tears, and Junipero shouted at her to take Arizona upstairs and hide somewhere. Cherry proceeded to support Arizona as he hobbled up the stairs at this rather drab building, which had been used to record many songs and indoor scenes of films that had featured Bluebell Jansen, and was still used for many capital productions. Arizona wheezed in pain once they made it just one floor above the ground, and apparently realizing that they could not travel further in this condition, Cherry quickly headed along a corridor with him and found a cupboard that contained some old microphones and lighting equipment, which had enough space for them to hide in. She practically pushed Arizona into the cupboard as a scream was heard downstairs, before quickly climbing in after him. Although Arizona continued to whimper in pain, Cherry whispered at him to be quiet. Meanwhile, downstairs, Junipero and Madison had just about managed to keep the door closed against Aurus and Paulus, yet whilst Aurus had his arm through the door, they proceeded to push against the door, which trapped Aurus's wrist inside the gap and caused him intense pain. After some more screaming, Aurus stopped pushing against the door. Madison then said that they needed to run, and they quickly headed up the stairs and were on the first floor by the time that Discordia angrily pushed through the main door, while shouting at Aurus to toughen up. Junipero quickly led Madison along a corridor, unknowingly past the cupboard where Cherry and Arizona were hiding, until they reached a sound studio on their left, which Junipero dragged Madison into. Junipero quickly grabbed a large speaker and jammed it against the door, although the room had a clear window to the corridor, so Madison said that they needed to stay down. Within seconds, singing was heard to be coming along the corridor towards them. Discordia, who it later emerged was in the choir for District 2, sang a song about there being no business-like show business as she walked past Cherry and Arizona's cupboard. As she sang in a rather out-of-tune pitch, the cameras showed Madison's expression to be one of pure bewilderment, but as the sound of the singing approached, Junipero quickly shoved himself against the speaker by the door, and Madison tucked herself as close to the wall as she could, so that she could not be seen from the outside. Yet they heard the careers stop by this door, and Mohair asked Discordia if she could stop that horrible racket, which upset Discordia as she enjoyed singing. Silence resumed, and Junipero and Madison looked at each other in an alarmed manner. But just when the cameras of the corridor outside the room showed Mohair about to ram her knife through the door, an extremely high-pitched scream was heard from the largest recording studio, which lay at the very end of this corridor.